in general, the overall male sexual behavior can be thought of quite simply as appetitive and consumatory behavior. Interestingly, I've studied this a lot from a different perspective. As sort of a dopamine researcher, it's very often that I'll be put in a panel with people that are also studying the role of dopamine in sexual behavior. And at some level, it really just sort of breaks down to what can be thought of as appetitive and consumatory behavior, which is something that I want to come back to quite a bit here at the end. But simply put, appetitive behavior would basically be the game. I mean, like the shake your tail feathers. Are you going to sing a great song? Are you an excellent dancer? How are you going to prove your worth? uh you know uh Maybe you still think that it has to do with how well you can control a ball, or yeah. But and interestingly, uh and really it isn't just about sex here, right? You can even generalize it a little bit more to broader motivated behaviors. But in this sort of very simple sexual behavioral cycle of appetitive and consumatory behavior, especially seen in males of certain species, the appetitive part is really, or the game is really where you see the greatest amount of diversity and individual variability. And it's really sort of a fascinating thing to see across species as well, especially when you bring birds into the mix, who have developed a whole cacophony of different species specific sort of mating rituals that are would all be sort of put in this appetitive seeking behavior. And interestingly, I mean, you see biological correlates as well, that are also generalized across motivated behaviors, whether it be sexual or seeking out a reward in the environment, for example. But you see similar neurobiological recruitment of certain brain pathways and regions, regardless of whether you're seeking out the best grad school to attend, or the best gift that you could possibly find for somebody, or which I guess could curtail a little bit into mating behavior. But yeah, it's the sort of the seeking versus taking is another way that it's typically referred to in a very simplistic way in the literature. So appetitive, or the game part, would be more of the seeking response, and then the taking part tends to be, there are certainly exceptions out there, but it tends to be more reflexive, a little bit more boring in a lot of ways. It's sort of an interesting thing when you sit back and think about it, and how much time is devoted to the seeking versus the taking, or the appetitive state versus the consumatory state. But anyway, of course, all of this is somewhat driven by hormones. And here we're going to be talking about several specific hormones involved in male reproduction. Of course, the neurohormones are going to be secreted from the hypothalamus. And then we're going to talk about two main players that are secreted by the anterior pituitary into the blood. We'll also be talking about the testes here, particularly two cell forms that exist within the testes. One that's very much involved in the production of sperm, and the other, the secretion of testosterone. Now, recall that not all testosterone is coming from the testes. There's also a fair amount coming from the adrenal cortex. But the functions are, really twofold. One is to develop sperm cells, and then in addition to producing testosterone, you are ultimately going to lead to the development of a variety of sex and secondary sex characteristics, like the deepening of the voice, etc. Development of certain hair. So here you can see the overall pathway, which should start look pretty similar at this point to other hormonal pathways throughout the body. You see your several levels of regulated release, starting with the hypothalamus, very typical, then going to the pituitary, in this case, the anterior pituitary, and then acting at effector sites throughout the body. In this case, most prominently, the testis. And you can also see negative feedback loops here, which are, of course, very important for hormonal and endocrine regulation. So first, the hormone that's being released from the hypothalamus is the gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which would act on the anterior pituitary to lead to the release of both luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. Luteinizing hormone is going to have its primary effect on the Leydig cells, which would lead to a release of testosterone. The majority of male testosterone would be coming from these, or being really led to the development of by these Leydig cells. The Sertoli cells, sometimes referred to as nurse cells, are basically there for promoting the development of the sperm in response to follicle stimulating hormone. The testis and the Sertoli cells, and associated with follicle stimulating hormone, also release a negative feedback chemical called inhibin. When inhibin goes up, it activates cells or receptors on the anterior pituitary to lead to a reduction of follicle stimulating hormone release through negative feedback. Heightened testosterone acts at a negative feedback regulator at both the level of the anterior pituitary, where it's going to reduce this secretion of luteinizing hormone, and at the level of the hypothalamus, where it would reduce the release of gonadotropin releasing hormone. So yeah, I mean, essentially what I just said, hypothalamus secretes gonadotropin releasing hormone. In response, there is going to be the release of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. It's also important to note that in the male, basically the male scientists had a meeting and decided we need their own name for follicle stimulating hormone just to confuse everybody. But yeah, there's another name for follicle stimulating hormone when we're talking about male development called interstitial cell stimulating hormone. I'm going to, mainly stick to follicle stimulating hormone, but if I do happen to say ICSH, or you read that in your book, know that it's really identical to follicle stimulating hormone. I really don't love the fact that there's that additional terminology. I find it unnecessary. But anyway, follicle stimulating hormone would promote the development of the sperm producing cells. Then the testicular interstitial cells would secrete the male sex hormone. Luteinizing hormone stimulates the supporting cells of the seminiferous tubules to respond to the testosterone as well. So follicle stimulating hormone, testosterone, and supporting cells contribute together to stimulate spermatogenic cells to give rise to the actual sperm. The supporting cells can also secrete inhibin, a hormone which inhibits the anterior pituitary gland to thereby reduce the secretion of follicle stimulating hormone. Here's the overall chart, flow chart, I guess would be a good way of putting it again. The hypothalamus would lead to the release of gonadotropin releasing hormone, which would act on the anterior pituitary to lead to the release of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Follicle stimulating hormone is going to have a more direct effect on the Sertoli cells, which, remember, are the sort of the nurse cells responsible for creating and facilitating spermatogenesis and the birth of the sperm. You are also going to see the development of inhibin through this process. So that's going to lead to the negative feedback at the level of the anterior pituitary to reduce the secretion of follicle stimulating hormone. Luteinizing hormone, by contrast, is primarily going to act on Leydig cells, where through a process involving Leydig cells, luteinizing hormone and to some extent the activation and preparation of the tubules, you're going to get a release of testosterone, which is also going to have negative feedback at both the level of the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. Male sex hormones in general are called androgens. Testosterone is one of the three main male sex androgens. Most of these are produced in the testicular interstitial cells, but small amounts are also produced in the adrenal cortex, which we've already covered. You should know at this point as well that these all tend to be steroidal in nature. I mean, if you think about them going back to our very first lecture, the distinction in this chemical structure of the steroid versus the peptides. But anyway, these are, of course, the steroid-based hormones are going to be more lipid soluble, but also last a little longer than your some more simple peptide-based hormones. But what is the main male sex hormone? That would be, testosterone. Production begins before birth and continues a few weeks after, but then it ceases, interestingly, and stops being produced until puberty brings it back on. Androgen is primarily produced in these Leydig cells, the sort of counterpart to the Sertoli cells that are more involved in the development of the sperm. Cholesterol, or these sort of steroid ring-like structures, serve as the primary substrate. The main androgen is testosterone, but there are three total forms: DHT, T or testosterone, and E2. These are involved in sex determination and differentiation, male reproductive organs, and the development of secondary sexual characteristics, spermatogenesis, and feedback on gonadotropin release. Testosterone stimulates the enlargement of the testes and male accessory organs. It also stimulates the development of male secondary sex characteristics, including growth of body hair, enlargement of the larynx and thickening of the vocal cords to lower the voice, deepen the voice, thickening of the skin. Males post-puberty literally have thicker skin, not emotionally. I almost guarantee you of that. But, we have evolved thicker skin theoretically to deal with things like animal fights and these sorts of things. We would have typical increases in muscular growth occurring with puberty, widening of shoulders, narrowing of the waist, that triangular shape that you always hear bodybuilders going on and on about. Thickening and strengthening of bones, and increases in the rate of cellular metabolism. But before birth, you can see testosterone having effects on masculinizing the reproductive tract in external genitalia. I mean, this does start very early on. And it also promotes the descent of the testes into the scrotum of most, but not all, mammals. You can also see effects on sex-specific tissues, like promoting the growth and maturation of the reproductive system at puberty, which is essential for spermatogenesis, and it also maintains the reproductive tract throughout adulthood. You can also see the development of sex drive occur at puberty, which also, and it also controls gonadotropin hormone secretion through negative feedback. We've already gone over the sexual male characteristics, and there are also, interestingly, non reproductive actions. There is a protein anabolic effect involved in muscle generation. You also see a promotion of bone growth at puberty, and also increased aggressive behavior. And in general, there is somewhat of a cumulative relationship here. The more testosterone, the more developed secondary sexual characteristics you will observe. So, what is the effective high levels of luteinizing hormone? Testosterone is going to be produced. What is the effective high levels of testosterone? This would slow the production of luteinizing hormone, which in turn slows the production of testosterone. So, what is the overall outcome of this on-off negative feedback cycle involving luteinizing hormone and testosterone? Really, you have near constant levels of both hormones existing in homeostasis in a post-pubertal male. Sex is typically meant as a way of really describing meiosis. I mean, if you remember back to high school biology with the little bead kits that you guys had to play with a macaroni maybe on string. But the whole idea here is that the idea of sex at the biological level, at the most primary level, tends to be associated with the division of gamete types. Sexual behavior has evolved in mammals to be one that really is meant to bring the two gamete types together, and really not just mammals. That's too myopic in scope. But the sex drive would actually be the motivational force that propels individuals to seek sexual union. Sex drive is a strong motivational force that propels individuals to seek sexual union. It's primitive and powerful. It evolved very early on, well before mammals. For example, in C. elegans, a very basic worm. So in this study, what the authors did is they, basically measured, C. elegans behavioral activity. And what they found, what you're looking at here is time and percent of time, percent on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. So they put the sort of the male worms around a food source, and then everywhere else in the environment there was no food source. But there were not any women or females around that food source. So what they found is that over time, pretty much all of the males gave up being in the area where the food source was to go look for the females. You could see some of the similar and a few interesting findings here. They see a similar effect for females, but it isn't as strong. And how many actually leave to go seek out the opposite sex. Virgins are much more strong, demonstrate this effect much more than gravid females. Gravid is a term really meant to indicate pregnancy in this case. Gravid literally means large. But hermaphrodites, I mean, some of these worms, have both male and female sexual characteristics. And interestingly, those that express both sexual gametes do not go as, at least in the worms, do not display as much sort of foraging behavior or appetitive seeking behavior. So, as I was saying at the very beginning, male sexual behavior can really be simplified and broken down into two phases: appetitive and consummatory. You see most motivated behaviors being broken down in this way, including looking for food. When uh, right, I mean, like for example, maybe searching on DoorDash. I mean, like you're really going to go through greater, thoughts and greater, emotional changes while you're actually hunting for that DoorDash order. And it might even be like more intense when you're out driving around looking for that best meal that you really want. And I mean, like, is it a McDonald's kind of night, or are you going for the best steak you can find? And that sort of appetitive sort of seeking phase recruits a very distinct form of neurobiology, and that neurobiological overlap appears very similar uh, to recruit similar structures and brain pathways, regardless of whether or not you're seeking food, sex, some big reward that you really want. But in all of these cases, the consummatory phase tends to be much shorter and in general more reflexive in nature. Like the all the buildup is to get there, and then in many cases the consummatory phase becomes much more practiced, or not much more reflexive, unless practice and experience really come into the picture. And again, this isn't only there with sex. I mean, it's also more generalizable. How you savor that steak dinner might be a little different if you've had quite a few steak dinners and you have a certain almost ritual set up in how you want to go through that consummatory process. But it's still, at some level, it becomes more habitual and or reflexive. And really, whether it's a habit or a reflex more depends again a lot on experience. But anyway, you know, male researchers equate arousal in general with motivation, like during the sort of appetitive seeking phase, and that is thought to be more motivationally driven. However, it is also worth pointing out that in general, motivation is difficult to precisely define. And this is even true if you really break it down biologically in humans. I mean, for example, one could define male arousal as anything that could be inferred by the presence of an erect penis. However, this is not fair or true whatsoever. I mean, like, for example, can someone not be aroused anymore if they had a spinal injury? Could someone not be aroused anymore if they have developed erectile dysfunction? They could very much still be aroused. And one I guess maybe more inclusive way of thinking of this would be defining it based off of just genital blood flow. But even there, you can find some problems. So it's like most things, it can become a little difficult to define the more you think about it. There is also coincidence between the onset of puberty and the development of the male sex drive, which suggests that it is the activation of the testes during puberty that really influences sexual motivation to some degree. Castration reduces the frequency of male mating behaviors, and treatment post castration with androgens restores this behavior. Androgens in general are thought to cause sexual behavior. Although, I don't want you to get the idea that there is just like an androgen spigot that, turns on and off. I mean, this, of course, is a lot. There's a lot more to it than just the on off of the androgen. Hormones most certainly change the probability that a particular behavior will be exhibited in a specific context. But the effects of the experience interact significantly with hormones to affect behavior. There is also thought to be some level of really species gradient. I mean, like whether it's intelligence or what have you. But you know what we might think of as to being higher evolved cognitive species like humans, you know, you might see a greater breakdown in this sort of like androgen spigot idea, and not to mention how you act, you know, is going to be influenced greatly by your experience, by what you've been taught by society, by what you've been taught by your culture, and to some extent, what you've learned on your own through trial and error. You know, so here are just some historical thoughts here, you know, that I think have been somewhat prominent at times throughout the way that we've thought about this as a humanity. Oh, I'm about to sneeze. No, it went away. It'll be back in like 3 seconds as soon as I don't want to sneeze. Male sex drive was regulated by distension or swelling of the seminal vesicles in the testes, and possibly this pressure that you know, men feel a little post puberty might actually be what activates male sexual behavior. You know, this was a very prominent, long held idea in sort of recent Western European thought, but finally fell out of favor as the presence or absence of the gonads is obviously not the only mediating factor. And you can restore behavior as well by restoring hormones if there has been damage or loss of the testicles. You know, sexual experience also is obviously going to affect behavior, both not only during the consumatory phase, but also during the appetitive or seeking phase. For example, sexually inexperienced male rats will show mating behavior with estrus females initially after they're castrated, but they will lose interest very quickly. By contrast, if you have sexually experienced male rats, they will continue to mate with females for weeks after being castrated. And you know, you can also see a very nice sort of dose response relationship here with uh, uh, general levels of testosterone. So here you can see them giving greater androgen, actually testosterone specific supplements to an animal that was just castrated. And you could see that there is like sort of the a window of range that is relation necessary to see the increase in sexual behavior in male animals. You know, one interesting real life observation here is I've known someone who, you know, after being diagnosed with testicular cancer, had to have their testes removed and replaced with prosthetics that did not actually secrete testosterone or other androgens. And you know, I remember asking them like, what did that sort of transition, you know, feel like? I mean, like, was there an ebb? Was there a flow? Like, I mean, like, how did it overall affect or change their behavior? And interestingly, I that their response was not. They felt absolutely no change whatsoever. You know, we have this down to measuring this window so accurately, and to be able to control it so accurately now, you can really, you know, not lose or change that much in your daily behavior if you already know, and of course they knew before they removed his testes, what your average level of testosterone in the blood would be, and then you simply just prescribe the proper amount to maintain that sort of set point, and no major differences are necessarily going to be observed. There are also, of course, social influences on male mating behavior. And, there are tons of examples that probably come to mind from this, from, just your own development. But I want to take this at a, more broad biological species level with a very, I think, humorous example of what is known as the Coolidge effect. So, President Calvin Coolidge and his wife were visiting a farm in the Midwest, and they were given separate tours. On these tours, they saw one rooster that was associated with very large flocks of hens. And they both thought to comment on this to their tour guides. Mrs. Coolidge asked the farmer how many times a day the rooster engaged in romance. The farmer told her several times a day, at which she responded, "Please relay that information to the president." Later during the tour, however, President Calvin Coolidge was given the same information about the copulatory prowess of the rooster. And the president then asked, same hen each time then? Oh, no, there's a different hen each time. Please relay that information to Mrs. Coolidge. So this has been become to be known as the Coolidge effect. And I think it's just one amazing social phenomenon regarding male sexual behavior. But males that have recently mated with a particular female appear to be uninterested in further copulation. However, if a new female is introduced, then the male will continue to mate. Thus, the introduction of novel females or other novel stimuli in some way, shape, or form can extend a male's sexual motivation and performance. And there's especially, sort of a biologically ingrained social construct to this. Here is a simple example here in sheep. But, they are comparing, a male sheep's response to the same female over and over and over. And you can see that the time that it takes to achieve ejaculation, increases quite sharply over the presentations or the pairings or presentations of the same female over and over. But if you mix that up so it's a different female, you see still relatively quick time to ejaculation, and also you would see greater engagement. And there's a lot of speculation as to why this might be. Again, a lot of it has been sort of linked to what is known as the sort of the seeking circuits in the brain that would involve, for example, dopamine. But it's probably a lot more than a single pathway. It would be really some complex network interacting together. There have been many studies on sort of the unique nature of human and primate sexual behavior. And really, I mean, there's a lot to say about this. We could spend an entire class period just on that alone. First, it's worth noting that different primates, which were all thought to be, I guess, somewhat evolutionarily related to, or closer on the phylogenetic tree than other species, of course. But the idea that I think is so important to note is that different primates have very different patterns of sexual behavior. You still see certain things that are reminiscent of male sexual behavior, but in different primates in particular, you can see great distinctions. For example, the bonobo and the chimpanzee are two that I like to draw contrast to because they're so different. In the chimpanzee, the male tends to be very sexually dominant and similar to elk. If you've ever been up to Rocky Mountain National Park during breeding season, it's amazing to see, right? The one sort of dominant alpha elk battling off other alpha elk and bugling and all these things like, you better back off, with the herd around them. But it's very different across primate species. So that sort of behavior would describe more what you would observe in chimpanzees, where you have one very dominant alpha, and literally, if you cross them, you are going to have your face bitten off. Whereas the bonobos are also similarly related to humans from a genetic perspective. And the bonobos have a very different sexual style. They tend to be a lot less into domination and use sex more as sort of conflict resolution. They tend to have females playing a much more prominent role in their sexual hierarchies. And you also see a lot more same-sex episodes in the bonobo versus a chimpanzee. I don't know. I could go on and on about that. But now I just want to turn a little bit to patterns of sexual behavior, which was compiled from the Kinsey studies. There's a famous movie that came out about Kinsey recently. I'm sure somebody's brought up Kinsey to you in your previous psychological classes. We're not going to focus too much on Kinsey now, but Kinsey certainly made an impact by documenting some sexual habits in people, in married Americans, which coincided to some extent with anthropological data on human sexual behavior from non-Western societies and data about sexual behavior in non-human animals. So, as I've somewhat already alluded to, you see very powerful motivation to engage in sexual behavior, not only in humans, but in many other animals, even in worms. C. elegans. Young people in every culture examined often participate in premarital sexual activities despite threats of extreme punishment and disgrace if such activities are discovered. And there is also essentially at some level, a lack of sexual restraint, which is evidence, I think, for the strong power of the motivational drive to seek out and participate in sexual behavior. So why do you think people are motivated to have sex? It's fun, it feels good. Some people might, just say to reproduce. But, I also want to just sort of point out, and I think that this is somewhat humorous. There was a study that actually just gave people like a blank question. I mean, like, at this point in time, why do you want to have sex? They received 237 different reasons, some of which were, I want to get revenge. I want to get closer to God. I want to improve my sexual skills. I want to celebrate. She had pretty eyes. She touched my leg. Yeah, that does it every time. He had a really great sense of humor. So, I think that people are not going to have much issue finding a reason. And, there are certainly cultural and societal influences, but I do think that there is that just sort of big biological homing noise in the background, that is It's like I don't know if you even want to go there, but the power of the ring and the fellowship of the ring, it's like this sort of you know I mean, C. Elegans gave up food to seek it out, right? I mean, like, it's an incredibly powerful drive. But one big question still unanswered is, do hormones contribute to this clouding of logic many individuals experience during sexual arousal? There still, there isn't quite as much research on human sexual behavior as other things like cancer and coronavirus and other things. And, some of that, I think is reasonable, but, we could probably explore a little more. And one point to get into stereotyped mating postures. And that is one thing that humans are a little unique from. Part of this is just purely anatomical, that human females, basically we don't have, the male doesn't have to thrust quite as posterior for procreation to occur. And interestingly, in another Sapolsky book, he goes on and on about really how we are just very similar to other animals in terms of our behavior, but we just have some very slight nuanced adaptations that really resonate at the highest level. And sexual positions could be thought of as one of these things. It's not so much that our sexual positions are so different, but we certainly do move out of your typical stereotyped mating positions. As Karma Sutra, and the Vedas and other things, historically documented, uh, really going back to BC times. So, we developed a tendency to use non-stereotyped mating postures very early on in human evolution. And uh yeah, like I guess I don't have too much more to say with that, but most other non-human animals do stick to typical mating posture. And some of this likely does have to do with sheer anatomy and anatomical differences, but it is worth pointing out that there have been other positions observed in certain monkeys and certain animals, but it is sort of a strange abnormality that humans, and again, I think a lot of this just has to do with evolutionary hierarchy and where you are in the phylogenetic genetic tree. But yeah, not and not only are there differences in positions, but I mean, of course, other things that people might do during sexual behavior and sexual interaction between two people or more. Not something that you would see quite as much in other species. There are some exceptions, like I was saying, like orangutans will sometimes mate face to face, hanging upside down. And then many primates, including some bats, will actually engage in fellatio or oral sex. One of the ideas here is that this might actually extend a copulation period, leading to maybe an increase in sperm count, or even just the chance or probability that insemination will occur. Bonobos, I've already mentioned to about, are more of the let's have sex with everybody, very good for conflict resolution type primate. There are, of course, hormonal correlates to the onset of male sexual behavior. The average age of onset of masturbation for boys is about 13 and a half years, and the average age of first intercourse is decreasing actually. But it's now 61% of males have had sex by age 19. And in general, when blood plasma testosterone concentrations peak, so does the frequency of sexual behavior. really getting into the 20s. Andropause, or a loss in testosterone, has been reported to occur across men. This is highly variable, and there's probably a lot more treatments being sold for this than are needed at this point in time. But it does start to happen in some males at the age of around 70. There is huge individual variation here. Basically this, and not only in testosterone levels in sexual behavior. Here you're just looking at a Kinsey graph displaying how many basically sexual outlets, or ejaculations are there per week for you. There's someone out there that has 29. There are quite a few out there that have 2 or 3. I mean, again, there's a tremendous variability. Again, a lot of this is correlated with testosterone. In hypogonadal, that basically means males that have underdeveloped testes or gonads that are treated with testosterone show increases in masturbation, erections, coital attempts, etc., etc. There is some dose dependent here with certain behaviors, but in general, testosterone is going to increase all of these. Testosterone and DHT, as opposed to estradiol, are equally effective in improving sexual activity in hypogonadal men, neither blocking the estrogen receptors nor treating males with an aromatase inhibitor, which blocks the conversion to estrogen, influence sexual behavior. I just briefly want to touch on chemical castration. I don't want to, get too into this, but it is something that has existed for quite some time. And in psychiatry, it's been used to treat what psychiatrists have termed as paraphiliac disorders, basically abnormal behaviors. Some of these, of course, we could debate how abnormal they are, but maybe fraudurism is one that we could all get on board with. Fraudurism is where, basically you've developed this desire, this sexual need to rub your crotch on other people without their permission. So there are two chemical castration approaches. One is called CPA, one is called MPA. These are both basically anti-androgenic in nature. CPA interferes with binding of androgens to receptors and decreases luteinizing hormone secretion and subsequent testosterone production. MPA reduces plasma concentrations of testosterone. It reduces luteinizing hormone secretion and testosterone production. Also increases enzyme levels that metabolize testosterone. Blood plasma testosterone concentrations are usually less than 1 nanogram per milliliter after 60 days of MPA administration. This is going to be quite effective at reducing a variety of behaviors. Penis erection, by erotic slides was not affected, but self-ratings of arousal were. So it doesn't really seem to cure all paraphilias, but it does reduce the frequency of those fantasies, which would allow someone to benefit from additional counseling and so on and so forth. Elevated luteinizing hormone concentrations positively correlate with self-reports of sexual arousal. This is thought to be a mechanism for CPA and MPA's effectiveness in reducing inappropriate sexual behavior. Again, there have been a number of non-human primate studies that are related to sexual behavior. Free-ranging castrated adult male rhesus monkeys display fewer sexual behaviors than intact males. Daily injections of testosterone can restore mating behavior to pre-castration levels. Hormonal control of sexual behavior appears to similar to regulation of human sexual behavior, including large individual variation. I also briefly wanted to mention the preoptic area and the medial preoptic area. The preoptic area is a region of the brain anterior to the hypothalamus. It's really very similar to the hypothalamus in a lot of ways. The medial preoptic area neurons project to the dopamine neurons of the brain in the periaqueductal gray and ventral tegmental area. Dopamine in this pathway is thought to be very important for motivating these behaviors in addition to others. Lesions of this brain region severely disrupt copulation in male rhesus monkeys. However, lesion males will continue to masturbate and can maintain erections and ejaculate. So you're not abolishing physiological mechanisms. The MPOA integrates internal and external information relevant to mating behavior. And if you destroy it, you're thought to disable the integration of these factors and block the generation of appropriate sexual behavior. And it's also important to note that the individual differences in sex drive are retained following castration and restoration. So, if male A had a high sex drive before castration and testosterone therapy, they're going to have very similar sex drive to what they had before, suggesting that there are sort of learned neural correlates as well. And hormones are an important part, but really more of a catalyst, if you will, or just part of the signaling cascade. Steroid hormones binding in the male brain are most abundant or around the ventricles, including the hypothalamus, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. You see a distribution of sex steroid hormone receptors in the brain that is a very conserved feature throughout vertebrates. It's not just going to be in humans. Androgens change the speed of neurotransmission as well as the pattern of neural firing. Amongst neurons in the hypothalamus of the mammillary bodies. So the overall impact is going to have strong neural responses as well. And depending on how the brain is wired in an individual, you would see a distinction in the response of this heightened neurotransmission of certain pathways. Here's some interesting information from an fMRI study done on male marmosets. Here, these animals were exposed to odors from ovulatory and non-ovulatory females. They then measured brain responses and saw increases in the preoptic area and anterior hypothalamus areas, which are involved in sexual behavior. But they also saw activity in areas including the striatum, which is where a lot of the dopamine release is thought to end. And the striatum is thought to be known to as a key node in the basal ganglia, which really is involved in sort of action generation, like what you're going to do. The hippocampus would basically be where you remember to do it. And the periaqueductal gray is involved in a variety of responses as well, but it's also, periaqueductal gray is also known to regulate pain responses, amongst other things. But, and in general, many of these regions are involved in emotional processing and reward-seeking behavior. There are great social influences on male sexual behavior, which we've already talked about a little bit. This is just one little study of a sort of self-study that I thought was interesting. A scientist once maintained daily records of the weight of his beard trimmings in an electric razor because I guess maybe this was part of his process. I don't know. It seems a little weird to me. But regardless, he found that his beard trimmings were heavier immediately prior to and during his visits to his fiancee than at any other time, which he then further attributed to elevated androgen concentrations induced by sexual anticipation and sexual activity, Of course, you'd need to do a few follow-up studies to really draw that link, but an interesting idea nonetheless. Interestingly, watching erotic stimuli increases sexual arousal, both in self-assessment and erectile responses. But interestingly, you do not actually observe an increase in testosterone levels while watching erotic images. In addition, if you put a young man in a room, either alone or with a woman or a man, and the testosterone concentrations elevate by about 10% when they're around the live woman. You also see a rapid increase in testosterone that might increase risk. One idea is that the rapid increase in testosterone might increase risk taking as part of human courtship, which can also go very poorly at certain times as well. Right. But uh, there's a huge variation in aging. Around 50% of men over 80 years old have testosterone concentrations in the normal range for men that are from 25 to 60. Not all elderly men report sexual dysfunction. And it could also be one of these things that is also quite linked with one's mood or other things throughout life. That there could be periods of dysfunction that actually do go away with age. But in general, if an elderly man complains of impotence and his testosterone concentrations are low, then there are three possible neuroendocrine problems that might be responsible. One is that the hypothalamus may not release sufficient gonadotropin releasing hormone to normally stimulate testosterone production. Another is that the anterior pituitary may not release sufficient gonadotropins. And finally, the Leydig cells, remember the contrast to the Sertoli, may not produce sufficient androgens in response to gonadotropin stimulation. Based on the huge individual differences and variations seen in primates and humans, it has been suggested that male animals are far less dependent on hormones for sexual behavior the higher they are on the phylogenetic scale. Most birds and rodents show decreases in sexual behavior immediately following castration, but in monkeys and humans, really you see this sexual behavior depending a lot more on prior experience, and not to mention how we mate and how we seek it out, and to probably arguably a lesser extent consume it varies quite a bit on experience, society, and culture.